So where I last left you was the idea that Australia's pre-contact world, or the world of pre-contact Australia, was one of 500 nations, these First Nations, that occupied the entire continent, a diverse and vibrant place full of many different cultures, traditions, languages, beliefs, something we need to be very respectful of and something we need to be very careful to overgeneralize and simplify. It's a very rich and alive continent prior to the arrival of the Europeans. When the Europeans arrive, there is a pattern of settlement we can discern along what we start to refer to as the frontier. By frontier, I mean the line of settlement. Think of it as a moving fence line, an invisible line shifting forward into the territories of these First Nations. It's a moving frontier. It's not one permanent border as exists between our current states. It's an invisible line of movement of people. At that line of people, there are discernible patterns of behaviour, and these patterns of behaviour are about essentially dispossession and replacement. Where European settlement comes into Australia, we see the dissolution of the First Nations that existed in that area. We see the collapse of those civilizations and a replacement of those civilizations with a European, a Western civilization, usually along British imperial lines. We get the creation of the modern Australia. So we're seeing patterns along the frontier of dispossession and replacement. Now, how does this line move? It moves with settlers, with what First Nations would perhaps say the invaders. It moves along rivers, along waterways, along lines of communication, along resources. The Europeans are often moving into Australia's interior, searching for grasslands for sheep and cattle, searching for water sources for human sheep and cattle. They're searching for gold. They're searching for minerals. So those lines of the frontier move where those resources are abundant, and those same resources that sustain animal life, sheep and cattle, and human life are the resources that sustain the lives of our first people, of their food sources, the kangaroo, the fish. So the lines of this frontier are uneven, they're moving, and they trace resources. And wherever that frontier moves, we see the full range of complex human interactions. Obviously, the name of our unit is the Frontier Wars. We see violence. We see atrocities. We see everything that goes with wars. We see refugees. We see betrayal. We see heroism. We see cowardice. We see male behaviours, female behaviours, children's behaviours, a complexity that we shouldn't generalise about either. It's way beyond this story of good guy, bad guy. The first area where we see the frontier expand is in the area of New South Wales, moving in from the area around Sydney Cove, through the Blue Mountains, and then into what's called the Western Plains, up behind the Great Dividing Range into what's now called Queensland, and down into Victoria behind the Great Dividing Range, into areas of Dubbo and so forth, Bathurst, into the grasslands of the interior behind our Great Dividing Range, and then moving westward. After that, our next discernible area around is in Tasmania, an area not only for convicts down at Port Arthur and around the settlement at Hobart, but that Hobart area was a a seaport, a whaling port, a sealing area, by sealing the hunting of seals, a fishing area. We then start to see the expansion into southern parts of what is now called Queensland. By the 1840s, we have the settlement of the Moreton Bay settlement here in Brisbane, still part of New South Wales. We see the penetration of these pastoral interests into Western Queensland on the other side of the Great Dividing Range, moving through areas of New South Wales called the New England district of Armidale and so forth, and into areas like Toowoomba now, the Darling Downs, moving into areas around Cunnamulla and Charleville and Roma, and of course spilling into the interior again. And of course this is about the same time that we see the expansion into Victoria, of Port Phillip Bay around Melbourne now, moving into Gippsland, the areas around the dairying areas where we had major bushfires at the start of 2020, moving into the areas towards Adelaide, pushing up where these lines connect, where these groups connect. And of course we have the opening by the 1850s and 1860s during the gold rushes of Victoria. We also have the gold rushes starting to take place around Gympie, Maryborough, moving into areas of northern parts of Queensland, following our rivers inland, following our rivers towards the Gulf of Carpentaria, spilling into the central grasslands of Queensland. Now, that process is in our most populated areas, except for the Northern Territory and Arnhem Land, our most populated areas of our First Peoples. So conflict is associated with that expansion. But let's not forget what's happening in the rest of the state. We do have settlements in the areas of Adelaide and the areas of the Swan River over in Western Australia. We do have settlements taking place along the northwest coast. We have farming and pastoralism. We see spreading along the coastlines and then finally into our interior, our desert areas. So this period of the frontier wars that we are looking at, this complex time of dispossession, of replacement, of violence and everything that goes with it, starts in 1788 and continues as late as the 1930s in the Northern Territory.